I've got about 11,000 photographs from that island. The Navy has seen maybe 40 of them. The rest sit on a hard drive in a drawer in my mother's house in Toledo under a stack of Christmas cards, and I haven't opened that drawer in 4 years. Not because they're classified. Some are, most aren't. I haven't opened it because of one frame. Frame 3442. It's not even a good photograph. It's out of focus, half of it is dark, and my hands were shaking so bad you can see the horizon tilt. It's a woman coming out of a tree line at dawn. She is walking, not running, and there is blood on her that isn't hers, and behind her, one by one out of the smoke, come 9 people who were supposed to be dead. Everybody in the Navy has heard some version of what happened on that island. Most of the versions are wrong. Most of them make it sound cleaner than it was. And every single one of them leaves out the part that actually matters, which is what a man named Trent Byard said to her on the boat 11 days before, with a smirk on his face and a rippet in his hand. I know exactly what he said, because I was 3 feet away with a camera around my neck, and I laughed. God help me, I laughed too. My name is Danny Kowalczyk. Everybody called me Cowl because nobody wanted to try the rest of it. In the summer of that year, I was a mass communication specialist 2nd class combat camera. That's a real job and I'll defend it, but I'll also tell you the truth about how the men in that world saw us. We were tourists with expensive lenses. We showed up, we made them look good for recruiting posters, and we went home. Nobody wanted us there, not really. I'd been attached temporarily to a workup detachment out of Coronado, not a deployed team. A training detachment, a mixed bag of people who were between things. Guys who'd just finished a pipeline and were waiting on a slot. Guys who'd come back from someplace bad and were being quietly rehabbed. Instructors on rotation. And one lieutenant nobody could figure out. Our destination was a rock called Isla Sombra, 71 nautical miles off the Pacific coast of Panama. 2.5 miles long, shaped like a broken tooth. Old Spanish watchtower on the high end. On the low end, a collapsed guano mining complex from the 1800s, tunnels, catwalks, iron ladders rusted to lace, and about 40 concrete rooms that the Navy, in its wisdom, had turned into a live fire clearance course. They called it the Cathedral. I want to be careful how I describe it because I'm not going to hand anybody a map, but I'll say this. It was 40 stations. It went up and down and back into the hill. There were rooms where you came in through the floor. There were rooms with no floor at all. The last stretch went out onto an iron catwalk over a blowhole, and when the swell came in right, the whole island breathed under you like something asleep. Nobody had ever finished the cathedral solo, not in 6 years. There was a board bolted to the wall of the ready hut with the best attempts on it. 31 stations. 33. 34 by a guy who'd been medevaced out with a shattered femur and, I was told, cried about the stations, not the leg. Under the board, somebody had written in permanent marker, "The cathedral doesn't care." And under that in different handwriting, older, half worn off, "Neither did the woman who built it." I photographed that wall on my first afternoon. I remember thinking it was a joke, some old graffiti, some guy's ex-wife. I want you to hold onto that sentence. We'll come back to it. The ride out was on a landing craft that smelled like diesel and old bananas. 6 hours. Flat gray water, a sky the color of a nickel, and the kind of heat that doesn't come from the sun so much as it comes up out of the deck and into your boots. Our coxswain was a bosun's mate named Lupe Arriaga, a woman of about 50 with forearms like mooring lines, who had, according to legend, once thrown a lieutenant off her boat for putting a cup down on her chart table. Lupe didn't talk. Lupe drove. 12 of us sat in the well deck on our packs. Let me put the ones who matter in front of you. Senior Chief Amos Whitlock, 51 years old, which in that world is roughly 900. Long face, gray mustache he wasn't supposed to have, and a way of listening to a conversation for 20 minutes without adding one word to it. He carried a coffee can full of sand. Actual sand, actual coffee can, red plastic lid. Nobody asked about it. I asked about it once later, and I'll tell you what he said when we get there. Lieutenant Commander Gil Ferraro, our OIC. Good man, tired man, a guy with 3 kids and an ulcer and a laminated card of everybody's blood type in his breast pocket. He wanted this workup to end without paperwork. HM1 Ade Asankoya. Corpsman. Everyone called him Doc O. Enormous, gentle, sang gospel under his breath while he inventoried tourniquets, and had personally kept 4 people alive in a place he did not talk about. Petty Officer First Class Trent Bayed. I have to be fair to Bayed. That's the hard part of telling this. Bayed was 29 and he was, physically, the most impressive human being I have ever stood next to. Not gym impressive. Working impressive. Thick through the back and quiet on his feet, and I once watched him climb a knotted rope one-handed while eating a granola bar with the other, for no reason, because someone said something about his shoulder. He was also funny. That's what people leave out. He was genuinely, dangerously funny, the way certain men are, the kind of funny that makes a room want to belong to him. When Bayed decided something was ridiculous, it became ridiculous. He had that power. Every group has one guy who has that power, and it is never the smartest guy, and it is never the strongest guy, and it is always, always the funniest one. And Bayed had decided, before the boat left the pier, that Lieutenant Wren Calloway was ridiculous. She sat by herself on the port side, at the very end of the bench, with her back against the ramp housing. She was maybe 34, medium height. Brown hair cut blunt and short, not for any fashion reason but the way you cut hair when you don't want to think about it. Sunburned across the bridge of the nose, ropey forearms, a little scar on her chin like a comma. She had her boots off. That was the first thing I noticed, and I noticed it because it was weird. Everybody else was sitting there sweating in full kit like the boat might get boarded by pirates any minute. She'd taken her boots off, set them side by side, and was drying her socks over her knees. Then she took a small tin out of her pack, took a pinch of something out of the tin, and worked it into her heels with her thumbs. Then she put the socks back on. Then the boots. Laced them a specific way. I've never seen anybody lace boots that way, over and under, and a little knot pulled down flat against the tongue so it wouldn't rub. And then she leaned back and closed her eyes and, as far as I could tell, went asleep for 4 hours. Not sleep like pretending, sleep, mouth a little open, head rolling with the swell. Bayed watched her the whole time. I got it on camera, actually, without meaning to. I was shooting the boat wake and she's in the corner of the frame, asleep, and Bayed is in the other corner, and he's not looking at the ocean. The thing you need to understand, and I understood it then, which is why my laugh sits in my chest to this day, is that the smirk didn't come from nowhere. By the letter of the law, it was 2019 by the time women could go through the pipeline. And a few had. The first enlisted candidate had made it through a couple years back, and the Navy had been so terrified of a media circus that they'd released almost nothing about her, and the vacuum where the information should have been filled up, as vacuums do, with garbage. So there were rumors, there were always rumors, that standards had been dropped, that there was a special track, that someone somewhere had a phone number they could call. And then there was Calloway's file. Ferraro had passed the roster around on the pier, the way you do, so everybody knows who they're with. Names, rate, last 3 billets. Bayed read hers out loud. He didn't do it cruelly. That's what made it work. Calloway, Wren A. Lieutenant. He turned the page over, turned it back. Huh. What? Said one of the younger guys. A kid named Petties. Nothing. Bayed tilted the page toward the light. There's nothing. Commission 2 tour listed, then 3 years of nothing. Blank, then here. He handed it around. It went hand to hand. I looked at it too. It was blank. 3 years of a person's professional life, and where the billets should have been there were 3 lines that said, Admin TDY, duty not specified. That's it. Now if you know anything, you know that a blank spot in a service record can mean a lot of things. It can mean somebody spent 3 years doing something so quiet that the paperwork lives in a building with no windows. It can also mean somebody spent 3 years doing absolutely nothing. Bayad looked around the pier at all our faces, and he let the moment sit exactly as long as it needed to, because he was a natural, and then he said, 3 years of admin, and he tucked the roster under his arm and stretched. Boys, we're taking a filing cabinet to the cathedral. And everybody laughed. I laughed. Senior Chief Whitlock did not laugh. He was sitting on a bollard with his coffee can in his lap, and he looked out at the water like the water had said something to him. 6 hours later, the boat ramp came down on a beach the color of wet cement, and Isla Sombra took its first look at us. I've been to places that were beautiful and dangerous. Sombra was neither. It was ugly. Volcanic rock the color of a bad tooth. Scrub, cactus, a tree line up the slope of stunted, wind-bent hardwood with leaves like green leather. The whole windward side was white with bird lime. The smell hit you before the ramp was fully down, ammonia and iodine and old fish. 10,000 seabirds screamed at us continuously, 24 hours a day, for 11 days. The cathedral squatted at the north end. From the beach you could see the top 2 levels, concrete black window holes, a rusted crane arm sticking out over nothing like a broken finger. And behind it, up the ridge, the Spanish tower, still standing after 400 years, because whoever built that tower had built it out of hatred. Home, said Daco cheerfully, and hoisted a med bag on each shoulder. Bayad came down the ramp behind me with 2 crates. He looked up at the cathedral, and I watched something move across his face that I don't think he knew was showing. He wanted it. Bad. He had 34 stations on his mind, and the board on the Ready Hut wall, and the 2 years of his life he'd spent thinking about that board. I only understood that later. At the time I just thought, he's excited. Behind me, boots crunched on shell. Lieutenant Calloway came off the ramp last, carrying her own pack and someone else's radio bag, and she stopped at the tide line and stood there for a minute looking, not at the cathedral, but at the tree line up on the ridge, above and behind it. She looked at it the way you look at a dog you used to own. Then she said to nobody, it grew in. Bayad was right there, he heard it. Ma'am. She blinked, came back from wherever she'd been. Nothing. You been here before. And here, right here, she had a choice, and she made it, and it cost her 10 days of hell. She said, everybody's been somewhere. And she walked up the beach. Now let me tell you about the boat, the rip-it, the sentence. It happened on the 3rd day, which is important, because by the 3rd day everybody was in a certain kind of mood. The 3rd day we had a personnel transfer run. Lupe brought the boat back in with water and a replacement generator, and half the debt went down to the beach to unload. The tide was wrong, so the boat sat off 100 yards and we ferried it in on a little inflatable, and we did that for 4 hours in 102 degrees, and by the end, everybody's hands were raw and everybody had had it. We were sitting in the shade of the boat's ramp, the 6 of us. Bayad had a rip-it in his fist, warm. He drank half of it in one go and made a face and said something like, somebody should put a bar on this rock. Somebody else said, 9 days. And then Petties, the kid, 22, wanted so badly for Bayad to like him, said, hey, who's running the cathedral first? Which was a real question. There'd been talk. Ferraro had said individual attempts would start on day 5. Bayad had 34 stations already. It was assumed he'd go first, and it was assumed he'd finish, and it was assumed there'd be a photograph, and I'd take it, and it'd go in a magazine. Bayad shrugged, playing it down, enjoying it. Rotation, I guess. Rotation, said Petties. So like everybody attempts. There was a small silence. Everybody knew exactly what he was asking. And Bayad looked over his shoulder. Lieutenant Calloway was maybe 30 feet away. She was crouched by the generator crate with a multimeter, checking something nobody had asked her to check, and she was absolutely within earshot, and Bayed knew that. That's the point. That was the entire point. He turned back. He tipped the can up. And he said it pitched just loud enough, with his mouth crooked and his eyes bright, in the tone of a man dropping a punchline he'd been carrying around for 3 days. Come on, women can't be seals. Beat. They can be near seals. And he smirked. And brother, the beach came apart. Petty's actually put his head down between his knees. Somebody spit water. It was, I have to be honest, it was a good line, delivered perfectly, by a man at the height of his powers, and 11 exhausted men laughed until they had to hold their ribs. I laughed. I lifted my camera, because I laugh with a camera in my hands, and I took a picture of Bayed laughing. Frame 1109. Bayed, head back, throat exposed, teeth white, absolutely alive and absolutely certain, with the cathedral out of focus behind him. I've looked at that photograph more times than any other picture I've ever taken. Here's what she did. Nothing. She didn't stand up. She didn't turn around. She didn't go still either. That's the part I noticed later when I looked at the frames, because I kept shooting. She didn't freeze the way a person freezes when they've been hit. She finished the reading on the multimeter. She wrote it on the back of her hand with a pen. She unscrewed a terminal, cleaned it with her thumbnail, screwed it back down, and moved to the next one. Then she got up and picked up 2 water cans, one in each hand, 5 gallons apiece. And I want you to actually feel that. That's 83 pounds of water. And she walked them up the beach past all of us and up the switchback to the camp, and she didn't set them down once. Nobody said anything. I remember Doc O looking after her, with an expression I couldn't read. And Senior Chief Whitlock, who had been sitting on the ramp the whole time with his coffee can, stood up, dusted off his trousers, and said the first full sentence I'd heard him say in 3 days. He said, Bayed. Bayed still grinning, Senior. Whitlock looked at him for a long moment. He seemed to weigh several sentences. What he finally said was, drink your water. And he walked away up the beach. Bayed looked at me, shrugged, laughed. But I saw him check the can in his hand, like maybe there was something wrong with it. I want to say something before I go on, because if I don't, this is just another story about a jerk getting what's coming to him, and it isn't. The next morning at 4:30, I woke up because somebody was moving outside the tent. Camera guys sleep light. It's a professional deformity. You hear a noise, you think shot. I got up. It was that hour when the sky is the color of a fish. The birds were already going. And down at the bottom of the switchback, where we'd stacked the water cans, Lieutenant Calloway was doing something strange. She was walking the beach with a stick. Not walking the length of it, walking it in lines. Up 10 paces, turn back, like she was mowing it. Every so often she'd stop and crouch and prod at something with the stick, and then she'd stand and go on. I watched her for maybe 20 minutes. I didn't take a picture, which I regret. At the end of it, she went to the tide line and she stood there with her hands in her pockets and looked at the water for a long time, and then she said something. I was too far away to hear. It was very short. Then she walked back up and started the coffee. At breakfast she handed Bayed a cup first before anybody and said, "Morning." And Bayed, to his credit, and this is the thing, this is why I can't make him a cartoon, Bayed took it and looked a little uncomfortable and said, "Thanks, ma'am," and drank it. You want to know what I found out later? What she was doing on the beach with the stick. She was counting the freshwater seeps. The little places where, if you dig at low tide, you get water that's only about half salt. There were 4. She'd found all 4 in 20 minutes in the dark, in a place she'd supposedly never been. 10 days later, 3 of us drank from the second one. I'm getting ahead. Day 5, first attempts on the cathedral. Let me set the scene, because this is where the 10 days turn into a story instead of a grudge. The cathedral entrance is a hole in a concrete wall about waist high. You go in feet first, and you drop about 6 feet onto a slope of loose rock, and then it's dark, and it stays dark for a long time. The stations are marked with paint. Instructors, that was Whitlock and 2 others, sit in cages above the walls with red lenses on their lights and radios, and they score you. Some stations are shoot, some are move, some are think. There's one, Station 19, that is nothing but a rusted iron ladder rising 40 feet in the dark to a hatch that is, sometimes, unlocked. Sometimes. The rule is that you don't get told which. And the whole thing is on a clock, and the clock does not care about you. Bayard went second, after a wiry guy named Ruiz who dropped out at Station 11 with a torn hamstring. Bayard went in at 9:12. I couldn't shoot inside. Nobody but instructors goes inside. So I sat outside with the radio, up on a slab with a view of the exit hatch, and I listened. Ferraro sat next to me and chewed a pen. Station by station, Whitlock's voice, flat as a hospital corridor. 7, 12, 15 slow. You could hear the shots deep, muffled, coming up out of the ground like the island had a heartbeat. 50 minutes, an hour. 22. Ferraro said quietly, he's fast. 28. Ferraro stopped chewing the pen. 31. 33. And then a long, long silence. And then a sound I have never forgotten, which was Trent Bayard screaming. Not in pain, in rage. Somewhere down under the rock, muffled, an enormous animal noise, and then a crash, and then nothing. Whitlock's voice, 34 terminated, send Doc. He'd made 34. He'd tied the record. And Station 35, whatever it was, had beaten him, and he'd put his fist through something and broken 2 knuckles doing it. They brought him out through the hatch. Doc O taped the hand. Bayard sat on the slab in the sun with his hand in his lap and his eyes shut, and did not say one word for 2 hours. The record stood. That night nobody was funny. That's the thing about a room where one guy holds all the humor. When he puts it down, there's nothing there. We ate in silence. Somebody's radio played tinny music. The birds screamed. And Lieutenant Calloway got up, walked around the fire pit, sat down on the rock next to Trent Bayard, and asked him about Station 35. I could not believe it. He looked at her. He was in a state where he could have said anything. He said, it's a room. Okay. It's a room with a door in it, and there's nothing behind the door. What you do? I went through the door. She nodded slowly. She looked at the fire, she said, and there was nothing behind it. There was a wall. His voice cracked, actually cracked, and he hated it. It's a joke. It's a joke, ma'am. Somebody built a joke into a live fire course. You come through 34 stations and you get a door and a wall and the clock's still running and there's no exit, there's nothing, it's a... He stopped. He'd figured out he was talking to her, and he stopped. Calloway sat there with her elbows on her knees. And then she said, there's a hatch in the ceiling. Bayard's head came around. How would you know that? And she said, and I was 10 feet away, and I heard it, she said. Because there's a hatch in every room. Then she got up and went to bed. I couldn't sleep. So at about 100 I took my camera and I walked down to the cathedral by myself, which was stupid, and I stood at the base of the tower. There's a foundation stone at the corner where the Spanish tower meets the Navy's concrete. Somebody, when they poured that concrete, had set a small brass plate into it. The kind of plate a contractor sets. Nobody looks at those. It was green with sea air, and I had to rub it with my thumb and use my headlamp. It said, Cathedral Complex, Design and Layout. WACLLOWAY. 2019. I stood there in the dark with the birds screaming and my thumb on the letters. Ren A. Calloway. 3 years of duty not specified. She hadn't been to that island before. She'd built it. And that right there, at 1 in the morning on day 5, is not even close to the biggest thing she was hiding. Part 1 ends, ~2, 900 words of story. Full Part 1 continues below. Wait, let me keep going. I said I'd tell it, so I'll tell it properly. And there's more of day 5 and there's day 6 and 7. And they matter because you can't understand what she did on that beach at the end unless you understand what the 10 days before did to her. I didn't tell anyone about the plate. I want to be able to say I had a noble reason. I didn't. I had a camera reason. I thought, this is a story, and stories are things you hold until the right moment, and I told myself I was being a professional and I was being a coward. So I photographed it, frame 1847. And I went back to my rack. Day 6 it rained. You wouldn't think a place that ugly could improve, but the rain came in off the water in a gray wall and hit the island, and for about 40 minutes it was almost beautiful. The rock went black and shiny. The birds shut up. Everything smelled like wet stone instead of guano. Then it stopped and the heat came back and the whole island steamed, and it was worse than before. We ran a boat drill, getting on and off the inflatable in surf in kit. Lupe drove. It's genuinely dangerous. More people get hurt on small boats than you'd guess. And there was a moment where Petty's went in wrong and the boat came down and would have taken his head off, except that a hand closed on the drag strap of his kit and hauled him bodily under the tube and out the other side. Calloway, up to her chest in a trough, one arm hooked on the safety line, and she moved that kid 2 feet in about half a second. Petty's came up coughing. Everybody was yelling. Lupe was backing off the throttle. And in the confusion I heard Bayard in the bow say, "Nice grab," and I heard Calloway say, "He's heavy," and that was that. That night Petty sat next to her at chow, just sat, didn't say anything, ate his food. I photographed it, frame 2010, 2 people eating. That's the moment the group started to split, and nobody knew it, including them. Here's how a group like that splits. Not with an argument, with chairs. By day 7 at chow, there was Bayard's side of the fire and there was the other side. Nobody planned it. Nobody said a word about it. But Petty sat over there and Doc O sat over there and Ruiz with the hamstring hobbled over there and Whitlock sat exactly in the middle on a rock with his coffee can and looked at his boots. And Bayard, who felt it and who was in pain and who had 2 broken knuckles and a tied record and nothing else in his life, got funnier. That's what a certain kind of man does. He gets funnier. He did an impression of her lacing her boots. It was accurate and it was mean and 4 people laughed. And he did it 3 more times that week. And by the last time only Petty's laughed, and Petty's laughed because Bayard was looking at him. And Calloway kept handing him coffee. Every morning, first cup, morning. I asked Doc O about it once quietly while he was inventorying. I said, "Why does she do that?" Doc O didn't look up. He said, "Because he's on her team." I said, "He's a jerk to her." Doc O picked up a tourniquet, checked the buckle, put it down. He said, "Cowell, if you were bleeding out on that rock right now, and the only 2 people on this island were you and that man, do you know what he'd do?" "Well, yeah." "So does she?" He clicked his tongue. "She's not being nice, she's maintaining equipment." I've thought about that for 4 years. Day 8 she ran the cathedral. Ferraro told her at breakfast. She said, "Yes, sir," and went and got her kit. The whole detachment came out to the slab. All of them. Even the guys who had no reason to. Bayard came out with his hand taped and his sunglasses on and sat on the highest part of the slab with his forearms on his knees, and I got a shot of him from below, silhouetted, and it looks like a statue of a man watching an execution. Ferraro said quietly to me, "This is going to be bad." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because she designed it in 2019 and they've changed it 4 times since, and she doesn't know that." I didn't have time to react to the fact that he knew. She went in at 8:47. I've never heard silence like that slab. 12 men, 100 degrees, 10,000 birds, and nobody moved for 1 hour and 11 minutes. Whitlock's voice on the radio flat. 4, 9. Somebody muttered a number, I don't know who. 15, 19. 19 is the ladder in the dark, 40 feet, and the hatch that might be locked. Long pause, very long. 19, said Whitlock again, and there was something in it. Cleared. Ferraro exhaled through his teeth. 24. 28. Byatt hadn't moved. I looked at him. He was completely still, sunglasses on, and his taped hand was flat on the rock, and his good hand was closed so tight the tendon stood out. 31. 33. 34. And then Whitlock said, in a voice I had never heard from him, a voice with a crack in it. In 35. Petty's made a noise. Somebody said, oh. And then, very fast, one after another, like a man reading a sentence he can't believe. 36, 37, 38. Ferraro was standing. I didn't see him stand. 39. Silence 4 seconds, 5. The exit hatch is a rectangle of steel plate set flat into the concrete about 30 meters from the slab, and none of us were looking at it, because we were all looking at the radio in Ferraro's hand, and so nobody saw it open. We heard it. Clang. And Ren Calloway climbed up out of the ground into the sunlight on Isla Sombra with her helmet in her hand, and her hair flat with sweat and a cut over her right eyebrow, and she stood up. And she blinked at the light, and she said, to no one, in a completely conversational voice, somebody moved the ladder. Whitlock's voice on the radio into the silence. 40 course complete. Time, 1 hour 11 minutes 40 seconds. Nobody clapped. I want you to sit with that. 12 men watched a human being do the thing that had never been done. The thing that had cost one of them a femur and one of them 2 knuckles and all of them something. And nobody clapped, and I did not take a photograph, and I have never forgiven myself for either. The bird screamed. Doc O started toward her with the med kit, because of her eyebrow. And Trent Byatt stood up on the high part of the slab. Everybody turned, everybody. That's how much he had them. He hadn't said a word, and every head turned. He took off his sunglasses. He looked at her for about 3 seconds. And he said, how many attempts? She said, first. He nodded slowly, several times, like he was agreeing with someone else. Then he said, convenient, being the architect. And he walked down off the rock and past her close, and he went back to camp. And then people moved. Then it was awkward, and Doc O got to her. And Ferraro said something about a hot wash, and Ruiz clapped her once on the shoulder and looked embarrassed about it. And Petty's, 22 years old, ears sunburned, Byatt's biggest fan, stood there with his mouth open. He said out loud to nobody, wait, she built it. And that's how it got out. Ferraro had known, Whitlock had known, the instructors had known. And now everybody knew, and by supper time, the architect thing had gone around the fire and hardened into something ugly, because that's what a group does when it's frightened. She had the map. She knew every room. Of course she finished it. She wrote the answers. Nobody said it to her face. They didn't have to. You could hear it in the way the fire got quiet when she came near. She sat down, she ate. She got up. She washed her plate in a bucket, put it on the rack, and walked off into the dark. And Whitlock, sitting in the middle with his coffee can, spoke for the second time in 8 days. He said, the course has been rebuilt 4 times. Nobody answered. Stations 19 through 40 are not the ones she drew. He put the lid on his can. Not one of them. He got up. He said she did that cold. And he walked away, and the fire popped, and 11 men looked at each other and did not know what to do with their faces. Later, much later, I found Whitlock sitting on the slab in the dark. He had the coffee can open. He was letting sand run out of his fist into it, over and over, the way you do with a worry stone. I sat down. I'd learned by then that you didn't talk to Whitlock, you just sat near him and eventually he'd decide. After about 10 minutes he said, "You want to know about the can?" "I do." He tipped it, poured a little sand into his palm and looked at it in the starlight. He said, "This is off a beach, it's not this beach." I waited. He said, "There were 9 of us on it, I got off it." He tipped the sand back in. "Somebody came and got me off it, and I never found out who, because the whole thing was black and nobody would tell me, and I have spent 5 years wanting to buy that person a beer." He put the lid on. He said, "Cowell, when you're old, you'll figure out that the only thing you can't stand is not being able to say thank you." He looked out at the water. And he said, "I ran her prints." I said, "You did what?" "I ran her prints." He said it like a man confessing to a small, necessary crime. Day 2, coffee cup. He turned the can in his hands. It came back sealed, and there was a phone number on the seal, so I called the phone number. The bird screamed. I said, "Senior, what they say?" And Amos Whitlock, 51 years old, 900 years old, looked at me with an expression I could not photograph and would not have dared to. He said, "They asked me who I was, and then they said." And that's when the sky over the south end of the island lit up orange, and a sound came across the water like a door slamming in a house the size of the world, and the birds came off the rock all at once, 10,000 of them, screaming, and the night turned white. Lupe's boat was burning. There is a sound a boat makes when it burns. I didn't know that. I thought it would be loud the whole time. It isn't. The bang is at the start, the fuel, the vapor, and the empty tank space, and after that it goes almost quiet, and what you hear is a kind of long, low breathing, like something big and patient eating. We ran. 12 men down a switchback in the dark, in flip-flops, in skivvies, in whatever we'd been sitting in. I ran with a camera because that's a reflex I will have until I die. Ferraro ran with the laminated card of blood types in his fist, and I don't think he knew he was holding it. And the birds. I've told people about the birds and they nod and they don't get it. 10,000 seabirds went off that rock at once. It was like the island took a breath in. The sky filled, and they were between us and the stars, and their screaming was so loud that Ferraro was shouting into my ear from a foot away, and I couldn't hear one word. We came out onto the beach, and the water was orange. The landing craft was 200 yards off the sand at anchor where Lupe always put her. She was burning from the stern forward. The ramp was down. It was down, which was wrong. Lupe never left the ramp down. Doc O went straight into the water. I mean straight in. Full run, no pause, med bag over his head, and Ferraro screamed at him to stop, and Doc O did not stop, and Bayard went in 3 seconds behind him with his taped hand held up out of the salt like a man carrying a bird. I stood on the sand. I want that on the record. I stood on the sand with my camera, and I did not go in the water, and there is no photograph from that night, because my hands were shaking too badly to hold a 2-second exposure, and every frame I took is a black rectangle with an orange smear in it. The one who found her was Calloway. She didn't run in. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Doc O and Bayard swam for the boat and Calloway walked the tide line, walked it, fast, in that same mowing pattern I'd watched her do in the dark on day 4, and she went about 80 meters north and she stopped and she went down on her knees. Lupe Arriaga was face down in 6 inches of water. She had a life jacket on, not clipped, just pulled on. She'd made it maybe half the distance to shore. Calloway had her turned over and up on the sand before I got there. She was doing chest compressions with her whole body, from the hips, the way it's actually done and not the way it looks on television, and she was counting out loud in a flat, steady voice, and every so often she'd say, Lupe, and then go back to counting. She did that for 19 minutes. I know it was 19 minutes because Ferraro timed it, because Ferraro was the kind of man who timed things, and because somewhere in there Doc O came out of the surf and dropped beside them and took over the airway, and after a while Doc O put his hand on Calloway's shoulder. And she said no and kept going. And he said, ma'am. And she said no again and kept going, and Doc O let her go another 4 minutes and then he took her wrists. She stopped. She sat back on her heels in the wet sand. And she said something that I did not understand for another 11 days. She said they took the ramp down. Here's what a beach looks like at 300 when somebody has died on it. Everybody stands around. That's it. That's the whole thing. Nobody knows where to put their hands. Ruiz had a poncho liner and he stood there holding it, and nobody would tell him what to do with it, so he just held it. Petties threw up in the scrub, then he apologized. Nobody had asked him to. Ferraro said, get the sat phone. And Petties ran up the switchback, glad to have a job, and he came back down 11 minutes later with the sat phone and a face like a wet sheet. He said, sir, the case is open. Ferraro looked at him. Petty said, sir. The case was open and the antenna's gone and the spare's gone too, sir, both of them, and he stopped and swallowed. The radios, sir, the radios are in the pit. They're in the burn pit, sir. Nobody moved. Behind us, out in the dark, the boat breathed. Ferraro did the right things. I want that in here. He got everybody up off the sand and into the ready hut. He counted heads, 12, all present plus Lupe, and he said her name out loud as part of the count, which broke something in Petty's. He put 2 men on the door. He sent Ruiz and 1 other up to the tower to look at the water. He said, it's a fuel fire. It's an accident. We do 100% inventory, we do a comms check on the vehicle set, and at 0600 we walk the whole island in pairs and find out what we've got. And Senior Chief Whitlock, standing by the wall under the board that said the cathedral doesn't care, said, sir, it's not an accident. Ferraro didn't turn around. He was looking at a map on the table. He said very quietly, Senior, I need it to be an accident for about 4 more hours. And Whitlock said, understood, sir. And that is the most honest exchange I have ever heard between 2 officers, and neither one of them was wrong. I went outside. I couldn't be in there. 12 men in a concrete room and the smell of everybody's fear, which is a real smell, and it's like copper and wet dog. Calloway was sitting on the step. She had a piece of something in her hands, turning it over. I sat down about 4 feet away, which was as close as I'd earned. She said without looking up, you take a lot of pictures. It's the job. Oh. She held up the thing in her hands. It was a chunk of orange plastic about the size of a deck of cards, melted on one side. There was a bolt hole in it, and a torn-off zip tie still through the hole. She said, do you know what this is? No. It's off Lupe's dead man switch, the kill lanyard. She turned it. You clip it to your vest. If you go over the side, the engine cuts. She looked out at the water. She said, it's on this side of the boat. It's on the beach. The boat is out there. I said, so it got blown off in the... It got cut off. She held it up so I could see. That zip tie's cut. And then somebody carried it 80 meters up the beach in their hand, and then they realized they were carrying it, and they threw it. I looked at the plastic. I looked at the water. I said, ma'am, there's nobody on this island. Ren Calloway put the plastic in her pocket. And she said, Cowoksik, there's always somebody on the island. Now, I have to back up and tell you about the tree line, because if I don't, the rest of this is unfair to you. Isla Sombra is 2.5 miles long. The cathedral and the camp and the beach are all in the northern third. The middle is a ridge you can't drive and don't want to walk. And the southern third is that stunted hardwood forest, leaves like green leather, the whole thing about 12 feet high and so dense you can't see 6 feet into it. Under the trees on the south end there's a bay, not a good bay, a bad one full of coral heads. No boat with any sense goes in there. And in 1958, the U.S. Navy, in a fit of enthusiasm, buried 411 tons of ordnance under the south end and forgot about it. That's not a secret. It's on the chart. It says danger, unexploded ordnance, landing prohibited in red, and everybody who works that island knows you do not go south of the ridge, and nobody has gone south of the ridge in 30 years. Nobody in a uniform anyway. That's the thing about a place that's on the chart as prohibited. It means no one will come. And there are people in this world for whom that phrase, no one will come, is the single most valuable piece of real estate information on Earth. At 4:30, the sky went fish-colored again. Ruiz came down from the tower and he was moving strange, in a fast walk that kept wanting to be a run, and he came into the hut and he said, "Sir, there's a boat in the South Bay." Ferraro said, "What kind of boat?" Ruiz said, "Sir, there's 3 boats in the South Bay." 40 minutes later, I was lying on my belly on the ridge with a 400 lens. Whitlock was on my left. Calloway was on my right. Bayard was 4 feet behind us, because Ferraro had said you don't go without a shooter, and Bayard had picked up a rifle with his broken hand and said, "I'm good, sir." And nobody had argued because nobody wanted to be the one who argued. The bay was a horseshoe of gray coral. The tide was low, and pulled up under the trees, invisible from the sea, invisible from the air, covered with cut brush and green cargo netting, were 3 long open fiberglass boats, panga hulls, the kind that run drugs and people and anything else across a lot of open water very fast and very low. Each one had 4 outboards on the transom. 4. And on the beach in front of them, laid out in rows under a tarp, were about 80 white bricks wrapped in plastic and tape. Whitlock said, without any inflection at all, "Well, I was shooting. I couldn't stop shooting. Frames 2606 through 2703, 97 photographs, and the file names are still on that hard drive." Calloway had a small pair of binoculars. She was not looking at the boats. She said, "Count the people." I panned. There were men on that beach. Not soldiers. I want to be careful because the story got told later like it was a war, and it wasn't. And if you tell it like a war, you make them into something bigger than they were. They were men in shorts and flip-flops, and one of them was wearing a Lakers jersey. Some had rifles. Most didn't. There was a cook fire. There was a radio playing. I counted 11. Calloway said, 14, 2 in the trees at 9 o'clock, 1 on the point. Bayard behind us said, "How many boats can they run at once?" And Whitlock said, "That's the wrong question, son." Bayard said, "What's the right question?" Whitlock lowered his glasses. He said, "The right question is, 80 bricks and 3 boats and 14 men, where's the rest of them?" Because those 3 boats could carry 60. They were a transfer point. Somebody was coming. Calloway hadn't moved. She was still glassing very slowly left to right, and then she stopped, and she stayed stopped for maybe 30 seconds. Then she said, "Kowalczyk, 200 meters, big tree, the one leaning." I found it. Below it in the shade, tell me what you see. I focused. There was a shipping container under that tree. Not new. Rust-streaked, faded blue and set into a cut in the hillside with brush piled on the roof. And in front of it, sitting in the dirt in a line with their backs against it, were 9 people. Their hands were behind them. I made a noise. I don't know what noise. Calloway said, "How many?" I said 9. And she lowered her binoculars, and she put her forehead down on her forearm in the dirt for exactly 1 second, and then she picked it up again, and her face was completely empty. She said, "That's not a drug camp." We got back to the hut at 7:10. Ferraro listened. Whitlock talked. Ferraro looked at my camera screen and he scrolled, and when he got to the container his jaw moved. He said, "Are they crew?" And Calloway said, "No, sir." "How do you know?" She said, "Because 4 of them are women and 2 of them are teenagers. And because they're tied and the crew isn't. And because there's a bucket, sir." Ferraro said, "A bucket?" "Yes, sir." Her voice never went up. "There's one bucket at the end of the line, and it's the reason those 9 people have been there more than a day." The hut was silent. Ferraro put both hands on the map table. He was a good man. He had 3 kids. He had an ulcer. And he had 12 people, 1 dead sailor, no radio, no boat, and no way on earth to tell anyone. He said, "When's the resupply?" Whitlock said, 9 days, sir. Day 17. 9 days. Yes, sir. Ferraro closed his eyes. He said, "Weapons." And there it was, the thing I had not let myself think about since 300. Whitlock said, "Sir, this is a training debt. We have 31 weapons. We have 1,100 rounds of simunition. We have 400 rounds of live 9mm for the range package. And we have 240 rounds of live 5.56 that came out on the boat for the pop-up course. 240 rounds. 14 men we'd counted, and however many were coming, and a container with 9 people against it." And somebody, I think it was Petty's, God love him, said in a small voice, "We could hide, sir. Right. We just 9 days. We stay north, we don't go south, they don't know we're here, and on day 17 the boat comes and..." Whitlock said, "They know we're here." Petty said, "How?" Whitlock looked at him. He said, "Because they killed a boat driver last night to make sure we couldn't leave." Let me tell you what that room felt like. 12 men understood. At the same moment, the actual shape of the thing. They hadn't blown the boat to escape. If they'd wanted to leave, they'd have left. They blew the boat and took the antennas and burned the radios and put a woman in the water because they had something coming, something big, something in the next few days, and they had a Navy detachment sitting on the north end of the island who would, on day 17, get on a boat and go tell the world about it. They didn't need to attack us. They needed us not to leave. And after whatever was coming had come and gone, they'd have 9 days of nothing to do but walk north. Ferraro said, "Okay." And then he said it again, "Okay." And he straightened up and he said, "Senior Chief, get me an inventory of every round on this rock by 0900. Doc, I want a casualty plan. Kowalczyk," and he looked at me, and it was the first time in 8 days anyone had looked at me like I mattered, "You have the only intelligence product we own. I want prints. I don't care how. Buy it." "Sir." "Your hand." Bayard said, "It's my left, sir." Ferraro nodded. And then he said, "Lieutenant Calloway." She said, "Sir." And Gil Ferraro looked at her for a long moment, and something happened in his face, and he said, "Ma'am, I'd like you to tell them now. I've thought about that sentence for 4 years. Ma'am, I'd like you to tell them now. Not tell us, tell them." He'd known since Coronado. Whitlock had known since day 2 and a phone call. She stood there. 12 men. A concrete room. A dead woman on a poncho liner outside the door under 2 rocks because we hadn't decided yet what to do with her. And Ren Calloway said, "I'm not the ranking authority in this room, sir." Ferraro said, "You're the only one who's done this." She said, "Sir." And Ferraro said, "Ren." She sat down on the edge of the map table. She was quiet for a while. She looked at her hands. Then she said, "My designator's fine. I'm a surface warfare officer. 2 tour, 1 on a destroyer, 1 on a staff." A pause. "In 2018, I got asked to go to a place where the people who asked me didn't have anybody who looked like me. And I said yes. And I was there on and off for 3 years, and I can tell you almost nothing about it. Nobody breathed. I never went through the pipeline. I'm not a SEAL. I have never claimed to be one, and I never will, and I want everyone in this room to be extremely clear about that, because a lot of good men earned that, and I'm not one of them. She looked up. What I was somebody they sent into places where a team couldn't go. Because a team is 8 men who look like a team. And I'm a 34-year-old woman with a bad haircut who can carry a bag through a checkpoint. Bayed was standing against the far wall with his arms crossed. I did that 31 times. Her voice did not change. I came out 29. Silence. Ruiz said, "Ma'am, the other 2. And she said, "Somebody came and got me." She kept going. That's the part that gets me. She just kept going, straight into the practical, like she was reading a checklist. In 2019, they brought me back and put me on a beach in Panama and told me to build a course, because I'd been complaining. Something moved at the corner of her mouth and vanished. I'd been complaining that everything we train on has a door, and a door means somebody built the room for you. So I built 40 rooms with no doors and a hatch in every ceiling, and I put a joke at Station 35, and then I went and did 4 more years of admin. She stood up off the table. "Sir, if we do nothing, in about 72 hours a mothership comes over that horizon and offloads onto those pangas, and when the transfer's done, 14 men and whoever else is going to walk 2.5 miles north and find 12 Americans with 240 rounds." Ferraro said, "And the 9 people at the container." Calloway said, "The 9 people at the container are the load, sir." I heard Daco say, "Lord," under his breath. "They're not hostages. Nobody's ransoming anybody. That container is a holding pen, and those pangas are going to be empty when they leave for whatever comes next." She said it as flatly as she'd said everything. "There will not be 9 people on that beach on Thursday." And Trent Bayed from the back wall said, "So what's the plan, ma'am?" You could hear the italics. Everybody could. Petty's went red. Ruiz looked at the floor. And Calloway turned around and looked at him. And for the first time in 8 days, she looked at him for longer than a second. She said, "Petty Officer Bayed, do you want to hit me?" Nobody moved. Bayed's jaw worked. She said, "It's a real question. I'd like an answer because I need to know what I've got and I don't have time to be polite about it. You've been at me since the pier. You're the best natural athlete on this island. You tied a 6-year record with a broken hand. You broke yourself. And I need you." She took one step. "So, do you want to hit me? Or do you want to go get those people?" Trent Bayed looked at her. And here's what I saw on his face, because I was 8 feet away and I have gone over it, and I am confident. He wanted to say something funny. He looked around the room for it. It was there, it was always there. He had never once in his life reached for it and found nothing. He found nothing. 12 men were looking at him, and there was no joke in the world. And Trent Bayed said, "Both, ma'am." And Calloway said, "Fair." And she turned back to the table and picked up a pencil and she said, "Senior Chief, I need the chart. I need every round we own laid out on this table in 90 minutes, and I need to know if the guano tunnels still connect to the south side." Whitlock said, "Ma'am, they were sealed in 94. She said, "By who?" And Whitlock, I swear to you, Whitlock smiled, first and only time. He said, "By the Navy, ma'am." And Calloway said, "Then they're not sealed." We worked all day. Doc O built a casualty station in the ready hut and made a list of who had what blood, and then made a second list of who he'd give it to first, and never showed anyone the second list. Ruiz and 2 others went up the tower with binoculars and a watch schedule. Petty's and I sat in a hot concrete room with a laptop and a printer that had no ink, and printed intelligence on a photo printer designed for making 4x6 keepsakes for sailors' mothers, and taped 97 of them to the wall in a grid. And that grid, that stupid, glossy, curling grid of holiday snapshot prints, is how the United States Navy learned what was happening on the south end of Isla Sombra. Bayed cleaned weapons, all of them, 31, alone, left-handed for 11 hours, and he didn't speak to anybody. And Ren Calloway went down into the cathedral by herself with a headlamp and a can of orange spray paint, and she came out at 2140 covered head to foot in wet black guano, and she walked into the hut and put a chunk of coral on the map table and said, "Station 26 has a crack in the floor. It drops into an old ore chute. The chute runs 1,100 meters on a bearing of 165 and it comes out." She put the coral down on the chart, south of the ridge. "Here, 90 meters behind the container." Whitlock leaned over the chart. He said, "Ma'am, that's under the ordnance dump." She said, "Yes." He said, "That's under 400 tons of 1958 ordnance." She said, "Yes, Senior Chief." She wiped her face with the back of her wrist and left a black smear across it. She said, "That's why nobody's watching it." And that night, day 9, with the boat still smoking out on the water and Lupe under 2 rocks and the birds slowly, one by one, coming back to the island because birds forget faster than we do. That night, Trent Bayed walked over to where Ren Calloway was sitting alone on the slab, and he stood there for a while, and then he sat down. He had 2 cups. He handed her one. He said, "Morning." It was 10 o'clock at night. She took it. They sat there. I watched from the hut door with my camera in my lap, and I did not lift it, because for once in my life I understood that some things are not photographs. After a long time, Bayed said, 35. She said, "The hatch in the ceiling, it's not in the ceiling, it's in the wall behind the false conduit." "Yeah," he turned the cup in his hands. "Yeah." Long pause. He said, "Why'd you build it like that?" And Ren Calloway looked out at the black water where a boat was still burning down to the water line, and she said, "Because one time I opened a door and there was a wall behind it, and I sat down in that room and I decided I was going to die there, and I was wrong." Bayed didn't say anything. She said, "I want everybody who ever comes out of that room to have already been wrong once, where it doesn't cost anything." She drank the coffee. And she said, "Bayed, tomorrow night I need somebody to go down an 1,100-meter ore chute under 400 tons of unexploded ordnance with a hand that doesn't work, and come up 90 meters behind 14 armed men, and not shoot anybody." Bayed sat very still. He said, "Why not shoot anybody?" And she said, "Because there's another 90 of them coming on Thursday, and if they hear a shot they don't stop coming. They just come ready." She stood up and looked down at him. She said, "I need a man who can be funny about it. Later, to the 9 people we bring back. Because they've been sitting against a wall for 3 days, and when they get out, they are going to need somebody to make them laugh so they can breathe." She started to walk away. And then she stopped and said the thing that ended him. She said, "That's what you're for. That's what you've always been for. You just aimed it at the wrong person." At 300 on day 10, I woke up because somebody was moving outside the tent. I got up. The sky was the color of a fish. The birds were back and starting up. And down at the bottom of the switchback, Trent Bayed was walking the beach in lines. Up 10 paces, turn back. Mowing it. With a stick. I stood in the dark and watched a man learn something, and I did not take the picture, and I will carry that particular failure to my grave alongside all the others, because it would have been the best photograph of my life. He stopped near the tide line and crouched and prodded at the sand. And he laughed, just once alone in the dark, delighted. He'd found the water. There's a thing nobody tells you about being scared for a long time. It gets boring. I always thought fear was a spike, a jolt, and it is for about 90 seconds, and then your body gets tired of it because a body can't hold that, and what's left is this flat gray hum, like a refrigerator in another room. You eat with it. You brush your teeth with it. On day 10, I sat on a bucket and cleaned my lenses for 2 hours with a dead woman under 2 rocks 40 feet away, and I was thinking about a girl I dated in high school. That's what it's actually like. I'm sorry if that's disappointing. Doc O caught me at it. He said, "Where were you?" I said, "Toledo." He nodded like that was the correct answer, and he went back to counting gauze. The plan was insane. I want to be precise about that, because in the retelling it always comes out sounding clever, and it wasn't clever. It was the least stupid thing available, which is a completely different animal. Here it was. 4 people go into the cathedral, down to station 26, through the crack in the floor into the old ore chute, 1,100 meters on a bearing of 165, downhill through a 19th century guano works, under a hillside packed with 411 tons of ordnance that had been rusting in tropical soil since Eisenhower. Come out 90 meters behind the container. Take the 9. Bring them back the same way. And do all of it without a single shot fired, because Thursday was coming. Ferraro asked the only question that mattered. He said, "Ma'am, if you're wrong about that chute, we lose 4. And Calloway said, "Yes, sir." He said, "And if we do nothing, we lose 9 on Thursday and probably 12 after." She said, "Yes, sir." Ferraro looked at the chart for a long time. Then he said, "Who?" She'd already written it on the back of her hand. She read it off. "Bayard Whitlock Petties, pause, me." Ferraro said, "Not Petties." "Sir, he's 22. And Calloway said, "Sir, he's 140 pounds and he's the only one of us who fits." That's when I understood the actual dimensions of the thing we were talking about. That's when my stomach went. Ferraro said, "How narrow?" And Whitlock from the wall said, "Sir, at the pinch it's about 19 inches. 19 inches. Take a ruler out. Go on, 19 inches. That's a rectangle you can put your shoulders through if you turn them. And only if you exhale first. And only if you don't panic. And if you do panic, there is 1,100 meters of nothing behind you and 400 tons of ordnance overhead and no room to raise your hands above your chest." Bayard said, "How long's the pinch?" Calloway said, "I don't know." "You don't know?" I sprayed a mark at the crack in station 26. I went in 40 meters. I hit a bend. I came back. She said it flat. "I don't know, Bayard. Nobody knows. It's an ore chute from 1860-something, and the last man who knew what was in it has been dead for 100 years. Bayard stared at her. And then, and this is the moment, for me, this is where he turned. Trent Bayard said, "Okay, so we find out. Doc O rigged us." "Us, listen to me," I said us. "Because I went. Nobody asked me to. I want to be clear about that, because in the version that gets told at the bar, somebody always says the photographer was ordered along, and no. At about 1400 on day 10, I walked into that hut with my rig on my back and I said, 'Sir, if this works, the only thing that's going to save those people afterward is that somebody can prove it happened.'" Ferraro looked at me like he was seeing me. He said, "You'll be 5th. You'll be last through the pinch. If you get stuck, you're stuck." I said, "Yes, sir." And Bayard said from the corner, without looking up from a magazine he was loading with his good hand, "Tourists coming." He said it warmly. It was the first time. We went in at 2010, in the dark, on day 10. Doc O checked us at the hole. He did it one at a time, hands on shoulders, and to each of us he said the same 3 things. Knife where you can reach it left-handed. Light off unless you need it. Don't lie to me about your air. Then he put both hands on the sides of Petty's head and said something so quietly, I only got the shape of it. Petty's nodded and went in. We dropped 6 feet onto the loose rock slope, and the dark closed up over us, and Isla Sombra swallowed 5 people. The cathedral in the dark, with red lenses, moving slow, is not the same building as the cathedral on a clock. On a clock, it's a machine. In the dark, going slow, it's a place, and it's an old, wet, breathing place, and it stinks like the underside of the world. We didn't run the stations. We just moved through the geometry of them, and Calloway went first, and she went through that building like a woman walking her own house at night. She didn't use her light. Not once, not for the whole first section. She'd reach out and touch a corner and turn. At one point Bayard whispered, "How?" And she whispered back, "I drew it." We passed Station 19, 40 feet of iron ladder going up into black. Whitlock stopped under it and shone his red lens up. And he said softly, "They moved the ladder." Calloway said, 2 meters left, and the hatch was locked. Whitlock said, "The hatch was locked." She said, "Ma'am, if that hatch is locked, Station 19 has no. There's a hatch in every room, Senior Chief." And she went on, and Amos Whitlock stood there under a ladder in the dark for 2 full seconds with his mouth slightly open, and then followed her. Station 26 is a room about the size of a 2-car garage, with a floor of poured concrete that has been sitting on unstable fill for 60 years. The crack was in the corner, orange spray paint around it. It wasn't a hole, it was a slot, maybe 5 feet long and at its widest where a slab had subsided about 2.5 feet. You went in feet first, on your back, and then the floor of the room became the ceiling of the chute, and the chute went down at maybe 15 degrees. Calloway sat on the edge of it. She said, "Order me, Petty's Bayard, Senior Chief, Kowalczyk." Bayard said, "Ma'am, I should be." And she said, "Bayard, if the pinch stops me, I need you behind Petty's, because you're the only one strong enough to pull him back out by his ankles, and you're the only one stupid enough to do it in that space." "Beat." Bayard said, "Ma'am, that's the nicest thing anybody said to me on this island." And in a rusted-out concrete room 100 feet under a bird colony, 4 exhausted people laughed, quietly, once. Then Wren Calloway lay down on her back and slid into the earth. I want to tell you about the chute properly, because it is the reason I don't take the subway. It was a rectangular timber and stone flume, about waist-high in the good stretches, built to slide bird excrement downhill to a loading pier that no longer exists. The timbers were still there, some of them. They'd gone soft and black, and where they'd gone entirely, the rock had come down and you had to move it, one piece at a time, backward, hand to hand, past 4 bodies. It was hot. That surprised me. I'd expected cold. It was 90 degrees and 100% humidity, and the air smelled like ammonia so strong that at 40 minutes in, Petty started making a small sound in his throat with every breath, and Whitlock said, "Kid, kid, through your shirt," and I heard cloth move. We went on our backs, and then on our bellies, and then, in one stretch of about 80 meters, on our sides, because the chute had rolled. Nobody talked. You talked and you tasted it. At about 600 meters, my headlamp caught something on the wall. Letters cut into the timber with a knife. Old, the wood had grown around them like skin over a wire. I couldn't read all of it. It was Spanish, and it was somebody's name and a date, and under the date, 3 words that even I could read. Dios no mira. God doesn't look. I lay there in 1,100 meters of dark under 400 tons of ordnance, and read a message from a man who had been dead for 130 years, and I understood exactly what he meant, and I have never once said that out loud until now. At 840 meters, we hit the pinch. Calloway's voice came back down the line, low, 1 word at a time, passed man to man like a bucket. 19 inches. 4 meters long. Bend in the middle. Pause. I'm going. And then for 4 minutes, there was the sound of a human being dragging herself through a space the size of a dryer vent, and the sound of rock and old timber, and the sound of her breathing, which was slow. It stayed slow. That's what I remember. Then nothing. Then from very far away and flat. Clear, come on. Petty's got stuck. Of course he did. He was the smallest of us, and he got about 2 meters in, and his rig snagged, and he panicked. And I don't say that as a criticism. I say it as a fact about what happens to primates in a hole. He couldn't go forward, and he couldn't go back, and his boots were kicking about 10 inches from Bayed's face, and he was making a high, thin noise that I will hear for the rest of my life. And Bayed put his good hand around the kid's ankle, not pulling, just holding it. And he said, in a completely normal, bored, conversational voice, "Petties, hey, Petties, you know what the worst part of this is?" The kicking slowed. "The worst part is I'm looking at your boots and you rebloused them wrong. You've had 4 years, man." A wet choking, half laugh from inside the rock. "Yeah, that's what I said, 4 years." Bayed's thumb was moving on the kid's ankle, back and forth. "Now here's what's happening. Your left shoulder strap is on a rock, I can see it. It's about a fist forward of your armpit. I want you to go down and then forward, not up, down." Silence. "Down, buddy." A scrape. There it is, there it is. Keep going, don't stop, don't stop, don't stop." And Petty's boots went away into the dark. And Trent Bayed put his forehead on the rock for 1 second and breathed out, and then he turned his shoulders and went in after him. I was last. 19 inches, 4 meters, exhale first. I'm not going to describe it. I'll tell you that halfway through, at the bend, my chest wouldn't expand, and I had a moment of total, animal clarity in which I understood that I was going to die there, and that they'd have to leave me, and that the only thing left of Danny Kowalczyk would be a hard drive nobody would ever open. And then a hand came out of the dark and took my wrist. Not pulling, holding. Whitlock's voice 6 inches away. "I've got you, tourist." And that's how I got through the pinch. A 51-year-old man held my wrist in a hole, and I have never told him what it did to me, and now I never will. We came out at 1:14 on day 11, into a stand of green leather hardwood, and the air was so clean it hurt. I lay on my back in the leaves and looked at the stars and shook. 1,100 meters, 5 hours and 4 minutes. 91 meters, on a bearing of 165 was the container. Now here is where I have to be very careful, because this is the part that got told wrong. We did not fight our way to that container. Nobody shot anybody. What actually happened is that 4 people lay in a tree line for 1 hour and 40 minutes and watched, and Ren Calloway wrote things in a notebook. Because that's the job. That is the actual job, and nobody makes a movie about it. She logged the guard rotation. 2 men, 90 minutes, changeover sloppy 3-minute overlap where both walked to the fire to get coffee. She logged the fire. She logged the radio, 1 channel, and a man who checked in with someone offshore every hour on the hour, and she wrote the times. She logged the dogs. There were 2 dogs. And she logged something none of us had seen from the ridge, a 5th boat, small, aluminum, pulled up alone 400 meters east under its own brush pile away from the pangas. Bayed whispered, "Why's that one separate?" And Calloway wrote in her notebook and whispered back, "Because it belongs to whoever they're afraid of." At 2:50 the guards changed, and both walked to the fire. 3 minutes. Whitlock and Bayed went across 91 meters of open ground on their bellies in 1 minute 40. Calloway went to the dogs. She had something in her hand from her pack. I don't know what it was, and she never said. She was gone 40 seconds, and when she came back the dogs were eating and they did not bark, and they did not bark for the rest of that night, and one of them followed her for a while. And I lay in the tree line with a camera, and I photographed nothing, because a flash is death and a shutter is a sound, and my whole professional existence became worthless in a stand of trees, and I have never been more useful in my life than I was in those 90 seconds when I did absolutely nothing. The container door was chained. Not locked, chained with a padlock, and the chain went through a hole somebody had cut with a torch. Byatt held the chain so it wouldn't ring. Whitlock cut it with bolt cutters wrapped in a t-shirt. And the door came open about a foot. Inside there were 9 people who had been sitting in the dark against a steel wall for 3 days, and what they saw was a red light and a man's face. Nobody screamed. I've asked myself 1,000 times why nobody screamed. I think it's because Trent Byatt got his head in the gap first, and what those 9 people saw, in the red light, was a big American with a smashed hand and a completely calm face who put one finger to his lips and then, I swear to God, smiled and gave them a thumbs up. And a woman inside started to cry silently with both hands over her mouth. Getting 9 people, 91 meters across open ground in the dark, takes a very long time. We did it in threes. Byatt carried a man who couldn't walk, an older man, maybe 60, whose feet had gone bad, carried him on his back with one arm with a broken hand, and he did it twice because he went back for a girl who had frozen. 14 years old, she was 14, she would not move. And Byatt knelt down in front of her in the dirt with men 40 meters away at a fire, and he did not touch her, and he whispered something to her. I asked him weeks later what he'd said. He said, I told her my boot was untied and I needed her to check, because I couldn't see it. I said, why? And Trent Byatt said, because you can't be frozen and helpful at the same time. Pick one. She got up, she looked at his boot, she said something to him in Spanish. And then she took his taped hand, the broken one, and she walked out of that camp holding it. There is a photograph. Frame 3109. It was taken at 3:55 on day 11, at the mouth of an ore chute in a hardwood stand, with the red lens on, at 1/15 of a second, and it is a blurred mess. You can see a girl's hand. You can see a man's taped knuckles. It is the only photograph I have ever sold, and I gave the money away, and I've never printed it larger than a postcard. 9 people would not fit through the pinch. We knew that going in. Calloway had known it since the map table. The old man's shoulders. A pregnant woman, did I mention that? There was a pregnant woman in the container, and I did not put it in earlier because I did not want you to know it until we were in the trees, the way we didn't know it until we were in the trees. Calloway looked at them in the dark. She said, Senior Chief, the timber at the pinch, soft. Whitlock said, rotten, ma'am. She said, can 2 men widen it from the downhill side in 3 hours without noise? Whitlock looked at that hole in the ground, and at 400 tons of ordnance over it, and at his own hands. He said, ma'am, if we take the timber out, that section may come down. She said, yes. He said, it may come down on whoever's in it. She said, yes, Senior Chief. Nobody said anything. And then Petty's, 22 years old, 140 pounds, sunburned ears, who had spent 8 days laughing at Byatt's jokes about a woman lacing her boots. Petty said, ma'am, I'll be in it. They took 4 hours. Byatt and Petty's and Whitlock. On their bellies, pulling 130-year-old timber out of a rock throat, one splinter at a time, and passing it back hand to hand. And every time the hillside settled, they stopped and lay still and listened to the sound of 400 tons of Eisenhower's ordnance shifting somewhere above them in the dirt. At 6:20, the sun came up. We couldn't move the 9 in daylight. We were 400 meters from a camp of 14 men who were about to wake up and find an empty container. So we sat in the trees. And that is when Wren Calloway did the thing that, of everything in 11 days, I think about most. She went back. Alone. In the dawn. 400 meters, and she went to the container and she picked up the cut chain and the padlock, and she closed the door and she looped the chain back through the hole, and she hung the open padlock in it so that from 20 feet away, from a man walking past with a coffee cup, it looked exactly like a locked door. And then she took the bucket, the one that told her everything on day 9, and she carried it out into the trees and set it down where nobody would see it. She bought us 19 hours. 19 hours, because a man named Carlos or James, or whoever, he was walked past that container at 700 on Wednesday and glanced at a chain, and went to breakfast, and did not open the door until Thursday afternoon. Bayed asked her about it in the trees, whispering, incredulous. He said, "Ma'am, if they'd looked." And she said, "Then they'd have found me standing there, and you'd have taken 9 people north and Ferraro would have had 1 day to move." Bayed sat with that. He said that was your plan, if they opened it. And Ren Calloway said, it wasn't a plan, it was a price. We moved them at 2200 on day 11. 9 civilians threw a widened pinch in an ore chute. It took 11 hours, and I am not going to describe it, and I couldn't if I wanted to. The pregnant woman's name was Yolanda. The old man's name was Ephraim. The girl's name was Marisol, and she went through holding Bayed's belt. We came up out of Station 26 into the cathedral at 9:10 on day 12, and we walked them through those 40 rooms in the dark. And the last thing between them and daylight was a hatch at Station 40, and Whitlock put his shoulder into it, and it opened onto the slab, and the light came down that hole like something out of a church. Doc O was standing there. He'd been standing there for 19 hours. And when Marisol came up out of the ground into the sun, Doc O started to sing. Quietly. He didn't decide to. It just came out of him, some old hymn, and I did not understand a word of it, and I have never heard anything like it before or since. Ferraro was there. He looked at 9 people and he counted them out loud. He said 9. And then he said it again, and his voice broke on it. We had 4 days until the resupply. Thursday was in about 30 hours. And at 1400 on day 12, Ruiz came down from the Spanish tower, running so hard he fell the last 10 feet and got up and kept running. He got to the hut and he couldn't talk. He handed Ferraro the binoculars and pointed south and east. Ferraro went up. I went with him. And out there, 12 miles off, sitting still on a flat gray sea, was a ship. Not a mothership, not a panga. A ship, 200 and something feet, rust-streaked, a boxy old coastal freighter with a crane and a hold and a stern deck, and she was hove to and she was waiting. Ferraro lowered the glasses. His face had no color in it. He said, "That's not a boat that carries product." And behind us on the tower stairs, Ren Calloway said, "No, sir, that's a boat that carries people." She was looking at it with her small binoculars. She said, "Sir, that container held 9. There's 3 pangas and 400 meters of beach. They weren't waiting on a load." She lowered the glasses. They were waiting on a place to put one. And then she said the sentence that put Trent Bayed's entire life in front of him, and mine, and everyone's. She said, "Sir, when that ship offloads, this island is going to have somewhere between 200 and 300 people on it, and about 90 of them will be armed, and the rest will be in a hold right now with their hands behind them." Ferraro said, "Ren." She said, "I know, sir." He said, "We have 240 rounds." And she said, "Sir, I don't need 240 rounds." She turned around and looked down at the cathedral. 40 rooms, concrete, catwalks, tunnels, hatches in every ceiling. An entire building, designed by one woman in 2019, out of spite, so that nobody would ever again open a door and find a wall. And she said, "I need them to come inside." Ship came in at 1640 on day 13. I photographed the whole thing from the Spanish tower with a 400 and a doubler, lying on 400 years of pigeon mess with my elbows on stone that somebody's slave had cut. And I want to tell you what it looked like, because the language everybody uses for this, trafficking, smuggling, load, is language built specifically so you don't have to see it. The freighter came to 200 meters off the South Bay and dropped an anchor with a rattle you could hear across the whole island. The three pangas went out to meet her. And then a hatch came off her afterdeck, and men started bringing people up out of the hold. They came up a ladder, one at a time, blinking. The light was that gold late afternoon light that photographers wait years for, and it fell on the top of that ladder like a spotlight, and 184 human beings climbed up out of the dark into it, one after another, for 51 minutes. I shot the whole thing. Frames 3,204 to 3,388. A man in a Steelers cap holding a woman's elbow. Two boys, maybe 10 and 12, in matching shirts somebody's mother had bought them. An old woman who stopped at the top of the ladder to put her hand flat on her own chest, like she was checking her heart was still in there. I have never shown those frames to anybody outside a courtroom. Here's the thing about 184 people and 3 pangas. 20 at a time, 9 trips. They started at 1710. By dark they had maybe 60 ashore, and they stopped, because coral heads in the dark will open a fiberglass hull like a can. So they stopped, and they left 120 people in a steel hold in the tropics overnight, and they put the 60 on the beach in rows, sitting, hands behind them. And on the beach the fires came up, and the radio played, and somebody laughed. Ferraro was next to me on the tower. He hadn't spoken in 11 minutes. Finally he said, "How many armed?" Calloway on my other side said, 91, sir, 14 from before, 62 off the ship, 15 still aboard. He said, "You counted?" She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "All of them?" And she said, "Sir, that's the whole job." We went down to the hut. And Gil Ferraro, lieutenant commander, 3 kids, ulcer, laminated card, stood at that map table with 11 Americans and 9 rescued civilians in the room behind him. And he made the hardest decision I have ever watched a man make. He said, "The resupply is Sunday, 4 days. He put his finger on the north end of the chart. We take everybody, 9 civilians, 11 of us. We go up past the cathedral into the old blockhouse, we seal it, we ration water from the seeps, and we sit for 4 days. When the boat comes, we signal it off, and it goes and gets a destroyer." Nobody said anything. By the time anybody comes back here, those 184 people are gone into whatever hole they're going into, and we will never, ever find them. He looked up. That's the plan that keeps 20 people alive. I want anybody who disagrees with it to say so out loud in the next 10 seconds, because after that we're doing it. The refrigerator hum. 10,000 birds. And Ren Calloway said, "Sir." She didn't argue with him. That's what I need you to understand. She didn't make a speech. There was no music. She said, "Sir, that's the correct order and I'll execute it." Ferraro's shoulders came down about an inch. And then she said, "And I request permission to remain behind." "No, sir." "No." His hand came down on the table. It was the first time in 13 days I'd heard him raise his voice. "Lieutenant, I am not writing a letter that says I left a naval officer alone on a rock with 91 armed men." She said, "Sir, then let me tell you what happens tomorrow." She turned the chart around. Tomorrow at first light, they move the other 120 ashore. That takes 6 hours. Then at some point tomorrow afternoon, a man is going to walk to that container to get the 9 people who are supposed to be in it, because they're on somebody's manifest, sir. And when he finds the door hanging open on a cut chain. She stopped. She let us do the arithmetic. They'll know. And they will not run, sir, because they have 184 people who cost them money and cannot be moved fast. They'll come north with 60 men, and they'll find 20 Americans in a concrete blockhouse with 240 rounds, and they will take 4 days, and they'll have them. Silence. Ferraro's jaw was working. She said quietly, "Sir, I bought you 19 hours. I can't buy 4 days." Whitlock said, "She's right, sir." Doc O said, "Sir." Ruiz said nothing, but he'd gone pale. And Ferraro looked around that room, and every face was the same face, and he said, "Then what do you want to do, Lieutenant? Because from where I stand there is no version of this where you win." And Ren Calloway said, "I don't need to win, sir. I need them to be inside when the sun comes up on Sunday." Here's the plan she drew, in pencil, on the back of a photo print of a shipping container. Point 1. They cannot leave without the pangas, and the pangas cannot leave without fuel. Point 2. There are 11 fuel drums under a tarp at the South Bay, and 1,100 meters of ore chute that comes up 90 meters behind them. Point 3. If the fuel goes, the freighter will not risk a night approach to that coral, and the freighter's master, a man who has never once in his life been on the beach, will pull off and wait for daylight. Point 4. 91 armed men will spend the night looking for whoever burned the fuel. And point 5, and here's where my stomach dropped out. They'll look north, and they'll find one person, and she'll be running, and she'll go into a hole in a wall at waist height. Ferraro said, "Ren, you can't take 90 men." And she said, "Sir, I don't intend to take any of them." She put the pencil down. The cathedral is 40 rooms. Every room has a hatch in the ceiling. No room has a door in the wall except one, and behind that door there's nothing. She looked up. There are 31 weapons on this island and a can of orange spray paint. Sir, I am going to lose them in that building for 30 hours. I am going to be in front of them the whole time. Every man who goes into the cathedral tomorrow night is one more man who is not on that beach when the resupply boat comes over the horizon on Sunday morning and sees 184 people sitting on the sand. Ferraro was very still. He said, "You want them to see it?" "Yes, sir." "You want Lupe's boat crew?" "I want a Navy coxswain," said Ren Calloway, "to come around that headland on Sunday morning at 6 knots and see the whole thing and turn around." It was Bayard who said it. He'd been standing against the back wall for the entire thing with his arms crossed and his taped hand under his armpit. He said, "Ma'am, 30 hours." She said, "Give or take." He said, "In there with them, alone." "Yes." And Trent Bayard said, "No." He came off the wall. "Ma'am, I'll do it. I've been in that building. I've got 34 stations." "You've got 34 stations and 2 broken knuckles." "I don't need." "Bayard," she said at once. He stopped. "You've got 34 stations because you went through the door." He stood there. She said, "And there was a wall behind it, and you screamed and you put your hand through something." Nobody breathed. "That's not a criticism. That's the building working. That's what it's for." She stepped around the table. "But tomorrow night there are going to be 60 men in there, and the last room is going to have a wall behind the door, and I need the person in front of them to be somebody who has already sat down in that room once in the dark for real and decided she was going to die there." She looked up at him and found out she was wrong. Trent Bayard's face came apart. Not dramatically. He didn't cry. His mouth just did something and he turned his head away. And Amos Whitlock from the wall said, "Ma'am, Belize." Everything stopped. Calloway went absolutely still. She did not turn around. Whitlock said, "It wasn't Belize, was it?" "Nothing." He said, "But there were 9 of us on a beach, and we had 4 hours, and somebody came in on a boat that wasn't on any list and took 8 off and went back for the 9th. "Nothing." "And the 9th one was me. And I've been carrying a coffee can full of that sand for 5 years, ma'am, because nobody would tell me who." "The birds." And Ren Calloway said, without turning around in a completely flat voice, "Senior Chief, I don't know what you're talking about." And Amos Whitlock said, "Yes, ma'am." And then he took the red plastic lid off the coffee can, and he walked across that hut, and he set it down on the map table in front of her, and he said, "Then you keep it, because I don't want it anymore." Ferraro let it go for about 10 seconds. Then he said, "Senior Chief, are you telling me?" And Whitlock said, "Sir, I'm telling you that when I called that number, they took my name, and they held me on the line for 6 minutes, and then a different man came on and said one sentence." Ferraro said, "What sentence?" And Amos Whitlock said, "He said, whatever she asks you for, give it to her, and then forget you called." Ferraro closed his eyes. He stood there with his hands flat on the chart of an island that had 411 tons of ordnance under it and 184 people on it, and he made the call. He said, "Lieutenant Calloway." "Sir." "You are not authorized to engage. You will not initiate contact with armed personnel. Your task is the fuel, and after that your task is to survive until Sunday, and if the building doesn't hold you will break contact and go to ground." She said, "Yes, sir." They both knew it was a fiction. Every person in that room knew it was a fiction. That's what an order like that is. It's a thing a man says so that afterward, in front of a board, somebody can read it out loud. Ferraro's voice cracked just once. He said, "Wren, what do you need?" And she said, "Sir, I need 80 rounds. I need every pyro on the island. I need somebody to bring me a coffee at 600 on Sunday." And then she picked up Whitlock's coffee can, and she looked at it, and she put it in her cargo pocket. Day 14, Thursday. At 5:40, the pangas started running. At 11:20, I stood on the tower and photographed 184 people sitting in rows on a beach in the sun. At 1400, a man walked to the container and opened the door. I watched him through the glass. He stood there for maybe 8 seconds, then he ran. And at 1408, the entire South Camp came alive like a kicked hive. 19 Americans and 9 civilians went north. I want to name what that walk was. It was 28 people, 4 of them barely walking, carrying water and ammunition, and a pregnant woman on a litter made from a tent pole, up a switchback, and past the cathedral to a blockhouse that a Spaniard built to kill people from. Ephraim, the old man, would not be carried. He walked. It took him 2 hours to do 900 meters, and Bayard walked next to him the entire way at exactly his speed, saying nothing. Marisol carried a rifle magazine in each hand because Whitlock gave them to her and said, "These are yours, hold them." And she was 14, and it was the smartest thing I ever saw anyone do. And at the top of the switchback, at the place where you can see both the cathedral hatch and the whole gray sea, Wren Calloway stepped out of the line. She had 80 rounds, a rifle, a knife, 12 smoke grenades, 4 flashbangs, 1 radio with a dead battery she carried anyway because she wanted them to see an antenna, a headlamp with red lens, 2 liters of water, and a coffee can. She had no body armor. She'd given it to Yolanda. Ferraro shook her hand. He couldn't say anything. Doc O put his enormous hands on both sides of her head, the way he'd done to Petty's at the hole, and said something quietly, and she nodded. Whitlock came to attention. 51 years old in the dirt on an island, and he came to attention, and he did not salute because you do not salute in the field, and instead he said, "Ma'am." And she said, "Senior Chief." And Petty's 22, sunburned, who had laughed at her boots on day 3, stood there with his mouth working and got out, "Ma'am, I." And she said, "Petty's, you went in the hole." And she went past him. Bayard was last. She stopped in front of him. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Behind us the birds were going, and the light was starting to go orange. And Trent Bayard said, "Women can't be SEALs." She looked at him. He said it very quietly, with his eyes wet, and his mouth absolutely straight, and no smirk anywhere on his face for the rest of his life. That's what I said, on a boat, with a rippet in my hand. His throat moved. "Ma'am, I have to say it out loud to you before you go down there, because if I don't say it now I'm going to be a man who never said it." She waited. He said, "I'm sorry." And Ren Calloway put her hand on his shoulder. The only time I ever saw her touch anyone who wasn't bleeding, and she said, "Buy it, when they come out of that building on Sunday. They're going to be 19 and 20 and 22, and half of them didn't want to be here either." He nodded. She said, "Be funny at them. It's the only thing that works." And she turned around and walked down the slope alone. I did not go into the cathedral. Everything that follows I have from 3 sources. The first is what we heard from the blockhouse over 30 hours, which was a great deal. The second is a debrief I sat in on 9 weeks later in a windowless room in Virginia with a stenographer and 4 men who never gave their names. And the third is a notebook. She burned the fuel at 21:40 on Thursday. We saw it from the blockhouse. The whole south end lit orange and the sound came across the ridge like a door slamming, and I thought about Lupe, and the birds went up, and Marisol grabbed Ruiz's arm. 11 drums. She used 2 smoke grenades to walk it in, and then she used a thing she made out of a flare, and a length of det cord from the range package that Ferraro had signed for, and Whitlock had never turned in. And then she went north up the ridge in the dark, and she made sure this is in the notebook. This is underlined. She made sure that at 3 different points on that ridge, men saw her. She let them see the antenna. Because a woman running with a radio is a woman who can call for help, and you do not let her go. They put 60 men on the ridge behind her. She went into the cathedral through the mouth at 23:14 on Thursday night, feet first, and she did not come out again for 31 hours and 40 minutes. I'm going to tell you what she did, and it is going to sound like nothing. She did not fight 60 men. She moved 40 rooms, every one with a hatch in the ceiling and no door in the wall. A building with no corridors, designed in 2019 by a woman who had spent 3 years in places where doors got you killed, so that the only way from any room to any other room was up, or down, or through a hole you had to find in the dark. They came in behind her in a stack of 12, with lights. And the building ate them. Here is what 31 hours sounded like from a blockhouse 900 meters away. Thursday, 23:50, 3 shots, a long silence, then men shouting in Spanish, and the shouting had a shape to it we all recognized, because it's the shape shouting has when people can't find each other. Friday, 1:40, a flashbang, 1, and then for about 4 minutes nothing but running. Friday, 300, 2 shots. Friday, 4:10, 1 shot, and then a very long silence, and then someone in the cathedral screaming for a long time. And Doc O got up and walked out of the blockhouse and stood in the dark by himself. Friday, 900, nothing, 10 hours of nothing. 10 hours in which 28 people sat in a Spanish tower and did not speak, and Petties held Marisol's hand, and Bayard sat by the door with a rifle across his knees and did not blink, and Whitlock stared at the floor where his coffee can used to be. Friday, 1912, 4 shots spaced, very calm, 4 seconds apart. Friday, 2200 to Saturday, 400, smoke. We saw it coming up out of the hatches, all 40 of them at different times in different rooms, and I understood then what she was doing. She was making the building breathe, and every hatch that smoked was a place they had to go and check, and every place they had to check was 6 men who weren't looking for her. Saturday, 600, silence. Saturday, 1400, Ruiz, up on the tower, called down that men were coming out of the south hatch. Not running. Walking with their hands on their heads. 11 of them. They walked out into the sun and they sat down in the dirt in a line and they put their hands behind them, and they waited, because they had been told to. By 1700, there were 34 of them out there, sitting in rows. The way you sit when you have spent 30 hours in a building where a voice you cannot find has been saying, in Spanish, in the dark, from a hatch above your head, calmly, over and over, the words that Wren Calloway wrote on the back of her hand on Thursday afternoon and later read out to 4 men in a windowless room in Virginia. Ustedes tienen padres, yo no estoy aquí para ustedes. You have parents, I'm not here for you. She never killed 60 men. The number when it was counted was 6. 6 men in 31 hours, and every single one of them was one of the 14 from the original camp. And she knew every one of their faces, because she had lain in a tree line for 100 minutes on day 11 and written them down. 34 surrendered. 20 ran south and got in a panga with no fuel and paddled it into a coral head. And one man, and you already know which one, because he had his own aluminum boat pulled up alone 400 meters east, away from everybody, because that's how you know who's afraid of whom. One man went into Station 35. He went through the door. And at 6:30 on Sunday morning, day 16, a Navy landing craft came around the South Headland at 6 knots, with a 19-year-old bosun's mate at the helm who had never met Lupe Arriaga, and he saw a beach with 184 people on it. And he turned around. Up at the blockhouse, the sun came up. The birds went out over the water. Doc O had been standing at the door since 400. And Trent Byad, who had been given a direct order by Lieutenant Commander Gilbert Ferraro at 100 on Sunday morning, in front of witnesses, not to go down there, and who had said, "Yes, sir." Trent Byad was not in the blockhouse. He had gone down at 500 with a rifle and a cup of coffee. Because she'd asked for a coffee at 600, and she'd asked in front of everybody, and nobody had written it down. And there was exactly one man on that island who had been handed a cup by her every single morning for 8 days and had never once said thank you. I went after him. Of course I went after him. I had a camera. We got down to the slab at 5:55 and the cathedral was silent and smoking, and the exit hatch at Station 40 was shut, and Byad stood over it holding a cup of coffee in his good hand like an idiot, like a man at a bus stop, and he said, "Ma'am." "Nothing." He said, "Ma'am, it's 600. "Nothing." And Byad got down on his knees on that concrete and put his forehead on the steel plate. And I lifted the camera because I am a coward, and it is what I do instead of feeling things, and I framed him, and my finger was on the shutter. And that's when, out of the tree line up the ridge, not from the hatch, from the trees, 400 meters away, where nobody was looking, where nobody had thought to look, because there is a hatch in every room and the island is a room. Something moved. Here's what I want to say about that photograph before I describe it. Every good picture I ever took, I took because I saw something coming. That's the whole trick. You don't shoot the moment. You shoot the half second before the moment because by the time you see it, it's gone. Frame 3442 is the only photograph in my life that I did not see coming. My hands took it. My eye wasn't even properly in the finder. The horizon is tilted 11 degrees. The left third is a black smear of concrete. It's underexposed by a stop and a half because I hadn't touched a dial since 500 in the dark. And in the middle of it, small, is a woman walking out of a tree line at dawn. She came out at the top of the ridge, 400 meters up and behind us, out of the green leather hardwood into the first light. She was walking not fast, not staggering. She had a rifle slung across her back, muzzle down, which is the way you carry a rifle you have decided not to use anymore. Her left arm was in front of her, held against her stomach, and even at that distance you could see it was wrong. She was black from the waist up, guano, smoke, powder, blood. And behind her, out of the trees, one at a time, Spaced out along 100 meters of ridge came 9 people. I want to tell you who they were, because for 4 years everybody has asked me the wrong question about that photograph. They ask if those are the hostages. No. The 9 we took out of the container were in the blockhouse, 900 meters north, with Doc O. The 9 coming out of that tree line behind Ren Calloway were 9 men who had gone into the cathedral on Thursday night with rifles. They had their hands on their heads. The one in front was maybe 19. He was crying. Not from fear, I got close enough later to be sure of this. He was crying the way people cry when something has stopped. And the last one in the line was carrying another man on his back. Bayed was still on his knees on the hatch when I made a noise. He came up off that steel plate and he turned around and he saw her. And I have photographed war and I have photographed funerals, and I have never seen a human face do what Trent Bayed's face did. He didn't shout, he didn't run. He stood up straight and he transferred the coffee cup to his good hand, and he came to attention on a concrete slab in the dawn with a cup of coffee in his fist, while 9 armed prisoners walked down a ridge toward him. And Ren Calloway came down the switchback, and the birds went out over the water in a long white ribbon, and she stopped in front of him. She looked at the cup. She said, "Is that mine?" Bayed said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "What time is it?" He said, 6:02, ma'am, I'm late. And Ren Calloway laughed. It's the only time I ever heard it. It was a completely ordinary laugh, cracked and dry and about half a second long, and it came out of a woman who had been in a hole in the ground for 31 hours, and Bayed made a sound and put his hand over his mouth. She took the cup with her right hand. Her left didn't move. 2 fingers were the wrong shape, and there was a hole through the meat of her forearm about the size of a thumbnail, front and back, packed with something that tore.